Why? Because obviously
Tonight here with this amazing man.
life comes with a lot of things that are already pre-established, or at least appearing to line up. And this doesn't matter why. Hey guys, what is going on? What is going on? Welcome to my podcast. That is It's Not Rocket Science Coaching Podcast with Curtis. My name is Curtis Brooks. I am your host. Guys, as a men's life coach, I help men communicate their way to healthy relationships. I've been in this space for more than 10 years. I initially started off within the church, and I decided, you know what? I love what I'm doing here. I love my faith, and my faith has absolutely transformed my own life. And so I thought, what better way to help other men transform their lives? And so there's a lot more to that backstory that I want to share with you at some point, but um, perhaps we'll touch some bases on that particular story, or at least some of my backstory during this broadcast. But in any event, guys, once more, my name is Curtis Brooks. As a men's life coach, I help men communicate their way to healthy relationships, guys. And so part of that is starting this podcast. And as a men's life coach, uh, I have actually had my own challenges. So I think before you can actually coach someone or begin to help someone figure some things out, you're absolutely going to be going through your own challenges, and you have to figure your own challenges out first before we can begin to remove the speck or the plank from our brother's eye. So that being said, guys, so here I am at your service. So in this podcast, I will be talking about several components. I don't have a name for this particular podcast as of yet, so I'll probably be giving it a name thereafter once the podcast is completed. So for now, we're going to be talking about three different things here, and these items are not definitely not uh, allocated, or at least something that men deal with only. But because I'm a men's life coach, I want to talk about how men in particular are dealing with these different things and some of the challenges that they're facing. So first, we'll talk about avoidance. All right. And then secondly, we'll talk about adaptability. And we can only adapt with understanding. So oftentimes people in general, we're trying to adapt something. We're trying to take on a concept without actually fully understanding something. So again, adaptability can only take place with understanding. Without that adaptability, or at least that understanding, without that understanding, we come into areas or places of regret, or just the furthermore challenges, and trying to take hold of a concept, or at least changing habits. So thirdly, we'll be talking about measurable outcomes. Eventually, that means that we are producing the fruit that we are desiring. So that being said, guys, let's get started. Avoidance is, again, not necessarily something that men are dealing with only, but it is something that we deal with as men. And I recently have collaborated with an organization working in a fitness center, and I'm definitely not the fitness guru or anything like that, but I'm providing services to men who are in need of men's life coaching, but from a perspective or place from that understanding that men oftentimes will try to avoid things, and then even when we're using it to the benefit of our bodies, and again, keeping in shape, staying in shape, and that's wonderful. But in sometimes, or in some instances, doesn't mean all instances, but in some instances, those challenges that we're dealing with, we project those things into working out. We project those things in other areas, such as going out, going to the bar, drinking, and or at least staying out all night, or not being able to sleep, insomnia, or something like that. So again, we can end up dealing with a host of different things in all different kind of ways, but it always goes back, not always, but in most cases, it goes back to something that we're trying to avoid. So avoidance is huge, guys. It's huge. And perhaps this will even, again, paint a bigger picture. And I remember many, many years ago, I dealt with a situation when I was much younger, an old man now, but absolutely enjoying my place where I'm at right now as I'm getting older. I love it. But in any event, when I was much younger, as a child, I was molested, and I can safely say that without having to go through something, or at least having to avoid those things, because I've dealt with it. I had to hit that thing head on, and so. But before I got there, it was absolutely a challenge. I avoided it like the plague, and but it came to a point in life where I absolutely had to deal with that because all roads were saying, Curtis, you have to deal with this. And but before that, yeah, I was absolutely avoiding that thing, not wanting to face that I had been abused, or to, as a man, to say, hey, I'm a victim of something that I couldn't control, or at least didn't have the wherewithal to understand it. Yeah, I was a victim, and it was difficult to admit that because sometimes, just as men, that's just where we're at. And I don't even know if it was so much about ego as it was just perhaps the embarrassment. I don't know. I don't know if that was an ego thing, but just not fully understanding it. Sometimes you just need things broken down, and I think for me, it felt like life was breaking me down. It felt like nothing was going right, and until I dealt with that matter, uh, it was something that I needed to hear. And during the that particular challenge in my life, I found my faith in Christ as a Christian, though that was challenging as well because that means that you had to give up something, and not necessarily anything in particular, but I had to give up my embarrassment. I had to give up my lack of understanding to come to an understanding. I had to place someone or place God as authority in my life in order to let go. Because as long as I held on, I could have easily seen myself dealing with this until my late 70s or something of that nature. So, yeah, it was a challenge, guys. So I avoided this thing like a plague, but it came to, as I mentioned earlier, it came to a place in my life where I found myself just hitting one roadblock after the other. Again, all roads leading to this situation where I was molested. And again, even though it wasn't just the situation in itself, it was the roadblocks that were coming up in my mind. And so, if those roadblocks are coming up in my mind, naturally, guess what? My relationships were affected by those things. Because sometimes when you're dealing with something so powerful and abusive, or just a person taking something from you against your will, man, it's hard for it. It's hard to see anything positive. It's hard to see anything from a healthy perspective. So there I was looking at life from a just kind of twisted perspective, if you will. But it wasn't until life had led me down this road where here I was having to deal with the very thing that I'd been avoiding for so many years. I was in my mid 20s, early to mid 20s, when I finally dealt with this matter. So I want to encourage men, other men, and the millions of men and the women who love us as men, husbands and fathers, and uncles and nephews and cousins, and and the like, that avoidance will get you, or avoidance in itself leads to you and I dealing with this matter. And to choose not to deal with this matter is to really be fooling ourselves, because again, some of these things that we're dealing with, perhaps your situation is not being molested, sometimes it's, or some other form of abuse or something that you may be dealing with. But again, when something of this magnitude has been, again, you feel like something's been taken from you or against your will, and though it may sound so strange, well, it's like, well, it had happened. This whole molestation thing had been going on for years, but it's just weird how the mind, yeah, it's just weird how the mind, you begin to trust that person, and while you're in it, you don't necessarily see it as abuse, but that's what ends up happening, and so you end up dealing with the effects of that years later, perhaps, and so for me, that played out in my life. This whole avoidance thing, it played out in my life where me and my brothers and sisters, we fought like cats and dogs, man. I'm trying to tell you, man. And in most cases, I was the leader of the pack because I had this anger in me, and it just did something to me. It made me angry, and uh, uh, the lack of expression, or and it wasn't the avoidance of expression, it was the lack of expression. Again, not having the words to put those things together. It seemed like something had now turned against me. That was something that was uh, so wonderful. Expression in itself is absolutely wonderful, but now this expression has turned like it turned against me, if you will, almost like an enemy. And so now this enemy goes on the inside, on a journey on the inside, affecting, again, all areas of my life. And as it may be affecting all areas of your life. So know that avoidance is something that we all deal with. Men and, of course, men and women, children, we're all deal with avoidance. But at some point, all roads lead back to your relationships with yourself, first and foremost, but then, excuse me, those situations, again, whether it's mental, emotional, or sexual, or physical abuse, or any kind of trauma, those things are so powerful that it's hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel. It can even be hard to comprehend what I'm saying to you, that there is something better than continuously being in this place of avoidance. It can be hard to understand it. It can be hard to wrap our minds around it because we may have been dealing with this thing for so long. But I'm here to tell you there's life on the other side of avoidance, but you have to tackle that first, such as I did, and such as many other millions of men and women alike, children as well, having to deal with the very thing that was an assault or offense against our persons, if you will. So avoidance is huge, guys. Avoidance is huge. So if that's an area that you're dealing with, contact me. Leave me a message here on YouTube. Drop me a line here on YouTube here. And by the way, before we move on to our next area of conversation, please subscribe to this channel. If you haven't already subscribed to this channel, please subscribe. Click on the bell notifications so that you'll get all future broadcasts, podcasts, or any other videos that I will be committed to creating on this channel. So make sure that you are subscribed if you have not already. Again, click the bell notification to ensure that you are getting all of our, or at least being notified of our broadcasts, be it live broadcasts or pre-recorded videos. That you'll get that information once they've been uploaded, or know that we're going live at that particular time. So that being said, guys, we're talking about adaptability, and as I mentioned earlier, adaptability cannot take place without understanding, guys. Adaptability is yet another huge component, but in order to adapt to something, we must understand something. So let's kind of go back, or at least kind of reverse the wheels back a little bit for a moment here, and just mention that going back to this avoidance thing here, we kind of talked about that extensively, but I just want to mention that, and understanding something, we have to know what we are avoiding, and we have to be able to look at that thing or that situation as it is, guys. And I oftentimes we want to try and paint it a particular way or look at it from a different angle. But sometimes the best way to look at this particular thing that we're dealing with is head on. And if you're having trouble with looking at this thing head on, guys, there's lots of videos out there. Again, as I mentioned earlier, you can contact me. We can have a conversation, have some kind of consultation, and we can discuss these matters further. But the best way to look at these things in order to understand them is to look at them head on, at least accepting the situation as it is. And if we're not accepting that situation as it is, we can easily go back into a place of avoidance. And I may have mentioned this earlier when I was particularly talking about the subject matter avoidance, is that we as men, we can find ourselves avoiding things in all kinds of different ways. Again, whether that's working out, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with working out. That's something that we all need. Exercise and things of that nature. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with going to the bar, maybe hanging out with some friends, having a few cocktails, and catching up with some buddies, good friends, whatever, coworkers, after hour cocktails or something like that, after work cocktails, whatever. There's nothing wrong with any of those things. There's nothing wrong with contacting a friend and reaching out and say, hey, what's going on, man? I have a long time no hear from, and things of that nature. But what has a tendency to happen is that because we are avoiding a situation, we're still talking about understanding, but because we're avoiding a situation, we can find ourselves projecting these things again, projecting that thing that we need to deal with. We off we often again project ourselves onto working out now. Now we're going to the gym 5 times a week because we don't want to deal with this matter. And again, if that's your outfit, if that's something that you're doing, again, there's nothing wrong with that. That's what you want to do 5 to 6 times a week. That's great, perfect, wonderful. But again, look at the matter that sometimes we can be, as men, we can again be in a place of we're avoiding things. And so in order to understand something, we have to again be able to look at this thing head on and say, and ask ourselves that deep question: what am I avoiding? Do I really need to work out? Why am I working out as much as I am? Again, is there something that I need to be working on? And once we come to a place of again answering that question honestly about what we are dealing with, then we can get into the place of breaking down those barriers of communication and get into a place of understanding. So, oftentimes, yes, that is a barrier of communication. Again, the lack of communication. So, it's not necessarily just us having a two-way communication, but again, those things that we're speaking to ourselves in the midst of again this avoidance thing that we've got going on. And so again, breaking down those walls of communication, those barriers of communication that prevent us from understanding our situation. Again, looking at the situation for what it is as head on. That even I was, when I was dealing with my molestation situation many years ago as a kid, I eventually had to come to a place where I had to look at that thing head on. And a really quick story about that is that I remember years ago, again, and when I finally um, had the courage, and it absolutely takes courage to deal with that matter and again look at it for what it is. And so when I finally had the courage to deal with this matter, I remember going to the library in Las Vegas at the time. That's where I was living at. And I rented 2 books from the library, or at least checked out 2 books from the library. And I can't remember the first one because the first one it didn't connect with me that well. But I remember reading the forward and part of the first chapter, and it just didn't connect with me. But then the second book that I read was by Dr. Wayne Dyer. And unfortunately, he's no longer with us, but excellent writer, excellent writer. And in any event, he wrote this book called The Sacred Self, and perhaps some of you may have read the book, but I remember reading that book and read the foreword and things of that nature, and began reading the first chapter. And as I was reading the first chapter, still talking about understanding our situation and taking it head on. And as I read that first chapter, I remember speaking out loud, just as I'm sharing it with you now. I remember the tears came down my face, and I said the very words, I was molested. And I had to look at that thing head on for what it was. And from that point on, I began the work, heavy off into the work, man, heavy into it. And I wasn't going to stop there. It wasn't just a matter of just, hey, looking at it head on, but it was about finishing that book. And I was committed to finishing that book. And I did. And I found out a lot about myself. And it was absolutely awesome. So, again, guys, looking at your situation head on, being prepared to understand whatever your situation might be. Again, the level of avoidance can be us projecting ourselves into a space that we're working out, constantly working out, and sometimes, again, that's projection, where we're uh, placing uh, uh, ourselves in a different space, if you will, again, rather than actually dealing with it. I know projection and communication, but projecting ourselves off into other activities, if you will, again, be it working out and hanging out all night, or again, lack of sleep, and now you're dealing with insomnia or saying you can't sleep. And in some cases, or a lot of cases, it's probably the very thing that you're avoiding. And if you're avoiding something, that means that you have not looked at that situation head on. So, guys, there is no adaptability without understanding. Again, being able to look at your situation for what it is, looking at that situation head on, as I just shared with you in my situation, being able to say, hey, I was dealing with this, and this is what happened. Man, was that a wonderful release, and I needed it at that time. So that's why I can share this information with you so easily. So, that being said, guys, we're going to segue into our next topic, that is going to be measurable outcomes. So, once more, guys, if you have not subscribe to our channel, please do so. Once more, my name is Curtis Brooks. I'm a men's life coach. I help men communicate their way to healthy relationships. And part of doing that is, as I just mentioned to you, again, understanding, or at least adaptability for me has been accepting my role, accepting my situation. So I have a backstory just like you do. So if you're listening as a man, or you're a woman, and you know you have a husband or a guy friend, someone you love as a man, share this story with them, because, hey, you know what? As I said, I'm taking my situation head on and understanding that through healing, it's allow me to kind of step up to the plate, and take my rightful place, and that is helping other men. And so, again, I have a backstory just like you as a man. You have a backstory. We all have some kind of backstory. But that being said, guys, if you have not subscribed to our channel, please do so. That is going to be at Life Coaching for Men. So perhaps you've just stumbled on our channel. Thank you. Again, please do subscribe if you have not already. Make sure you click the bell notification so that you'll be notified of our upcoming broadcasts, or pre-recorded videos that I'm uploading at different times. So, again, that being said, guys, our next point that we're going to be segueing into is going to be measurable outcomes / producing the fruit that you desire. So now we've looked at avoidance, we've looked at um, adaptability / understanding. So again, there's no adaptability without understanding, and there is no tackling of your situation without taking it on. And again, dealing with the very thing that you're avoiding, that avoidance that we talked about that. And now we're talking about, again, measurable outcomes / producing the fruit that you desire. That essentially means that you have dealt with the avoidance. You've taken that thing head on. You know exactly what it is. You know exactly what keeps you up at night, what keeps you at that gym 6, 7 times a week. Again, not that there's anything wrong with that, but I want for us to have, again, looking at things realistically. Sometimes we're avoiding our family members. Sometimes we're avoiding our families and loved ones because We've got stuff on our brain, guys. Again, projecting ourselves, our physical bodies onto other activities, onto other people and other places. And perhaps you don't need to be at the bar. Perhaps you may end up even at the wrong place at the wrong time because you're trying to avoid something. So that being said, guys, we've talked about all of these different things. And naturally, in this natural progression, it will lead us into now producing the fruit of our desire. That essentially means that I've worked out the things, I've looked at the things I've been avoiding, I have become to understand certain things and adapted my behavior or understood my behavior for why and how I've been doing things and for what purpose and what essentially is the cover up. And when we can understand all of these different things, again, on a greater level, on a deeper level, uh, rubbing the veneer of an object or something, where something of a piece of furniture has some kind of lacquer, and that piece of furniture now needs to be redone or repurposed, and perhaps you're changing the color. You've got to take off that first coat or several coats of lacquer and get down to the essence of it. And that's what I'm suggesting that we do. And now that you've gotten to that, again, by looking at what the very thing you've been avoiding, again, understanding it and coming to a place of adapting your situation, not adapting with a cover up, but adapting through understanding, you can absolutely get to a place of uh, measurable outcomes. And that means that you are now speaking. And much of what I've been sharing with you is about speaking. What are you saying to yourself? What kind of conversation are you discussing in that self talk, if you will? I didn't mention it earlier, but uh, I'm just now going to introduce that self talk. It's absolutely very, very powerful. To our detriment in most cases, and to our benefit, absolutely to our advantage. But again, when we find ourselves avoiding certain things, when we find ourselves trying to do life without understanding, and without understanding, you cannot produce the fruit of which a particular object or a particular device. Let's just say you have a phone or something, some kind of brand new phone or something of that nature, an iPhone or the top of the line iPhone or Android, and it's got all these wonderful features. But until you can actually read the manual or at least perhaps watch some videos on how certain things work, especially if you don't know how they work or this device is new to you, you want to make sure that you understand it. You understand it. So until we can understand something, we cannot get the best use out of a phone or our bodies, our mind. We can't get the best use of our situation. It's not so much about understanding what the other person has gone through, because in most cases, the other person who may have offended us, they have long gone. They're perhaps doing something else. Who knows? So then we're left with the baggage. And that means that we've got to get the things in order. And so now this, unfortunately, it becomes our thing. And I know it's a painful thing to hear, but it becomes something that we have to deal with. Because if we don't deal with it, we can find ourselves waiting for them to deal with it, waiting for them to apologize to us. In some cases, we'll never get that apology. But again, now that we have dealt with the avoidance, we're taking this thing head on, we can absolutely produce or at least create measurable outcomes. And knowing that speech, the right speech, the proper speech, speech that aligns itself up with our outcome or what we're expecting. And it's interesting here because even with the different things that I've shared with you thus far, primarily being that I was molested as a youth, my level of expectation was absolutely in the pits. Because sometimes when these offenses are done, be it sexual abuse, verbal, mental, and emotional or physical abuse, when these things or some kind of trauma that you may be dealing with, these things absolutely play on our level of expectation. Again, they can absolutely hit us in all areas of life, if you will. Our communication or their lack thereof, building relationships becomes difficult to build a relationship. So, with that being said, once we tackle these things, we can absolutely now look at things from a different outcome, a different perspective, and begin to make sure that our speech, make sure that those conversations that we were once having, those things have now been eradicated, if you will. And there's a scripture in the Bible that speaks to that. God says, "Speak to the mountain and say, be thy removed and cast into the sea." And the friend, or at least a friend had said, I think my wife mentioned it as well, is that sometimes the things that we've been dealing with, be it trauma or certain abuses that we've dealt with, it doesn't, it may not mean that it goes away, but the effects of it are not as prominent, or they don't speak so loud, or not as noisy as it once were. And so, because of that, we can now hear things differently. We can see things differently. We can build better relationships. And it doesn't mean that sometimes our stuff won't come up in relationships. But the wonderful thing about this, guys, and producing now, again, measurable outcomes and producing the food that you desire, is that you're in control of it now. Whereas that there was a time where I thought I was in control of it. My avoidance was control. Yeah, it absolutely was control. But it came to a point where the very thing that I was avoiding was now controlling me. And the effects of it were now became physical, meaning that I'm now seeing failed relationships. You can hide it for so long, but at some point, the effects of it become physical. They become things that you're actually looking at now, things that you're dealing with now. And that to the person that is untrained, they may not know what's going on, but for the person who is trained and who understands certain things, perhaps your mate or partner, your wife, your spouse, has gone through some of the similar things. And so, through a trained eye, if you will, or a person who's gone through something similar, you can't escape. That means that some of your behavior is something similar to what they've dealt with. So, what appears to be hidden at one time, or our efforts in hiding something, absolutely becomes physical at some point, meaning that we become a product of what we've been trying to hide. Bad relationships, relationships that don't work out because we're dealing with the heaviness and the burdens of our past. So, uh, that being said, guys, you can absolutely produce measurable outcomes by making sure that your speech is lining up with what you're desiring and beginning to speak to those thoughts that try to speak something contrary. And one of the ways that I've found in my own research, and not only research, but the things I've practiced, sometimes it's a matter of waiting before you speak, not feeling that you have to be, or at least you have to say something so quickly. Just sometimes we just have to pause and take a deep breath. Pause and take a deep breath. Silence is absolutely powerful because in the silence, we can find ourselves, at least we can find that the thoughts, the right information comes if we wait. But oftentimes, because we don't wait, or we're rushed to try to, or at least try to defend ourselves, at least, we can find ourselves uh, just being an open book, because eventually what we're defending ourselves with are sometimes the vicissitudes of life, or at least in our speech, it comes out and say, wow, why did he say that? And we can sound just downright embarrassed, or at least look embarrassed, or feel embarrassed about a matter because, again, sometimes it's just a matter of guys of just pausing before we speak. That being said, guys, I'm going to wrap this up, guys, and say thank you for listening, and I hope this podcast has been a blessing to you. I will be back with another podcast here shortly. So that being said, guys, I want to say thank you. Have a wonderful day, and we will talk with you later. Ciao for now. Bye bye. Why? Because obviously
Next here with this amazing man.
life comes with a lot of things that are already pre-established, or at least appearing to line up, and this does not.